Good morning. We come in our daily Bible reading to Mark chapter 13. And what we find in this chapter is Jesus' warning of days to come. And not just any days to come, but specific events that we need to be prepared for, and that in some cases the Jews needed to be prepared for. When you think about Jesus, of course, we're nearing the end of the Gospel of Mark, which means we're nearing the end of his life pre-crucifixion. The Jews lived, and some accepted, but many rejected and would continue to reject Jesus as Christ, both Son of Man and Son of God. There will be a price to be paid for rejecting God and his will. We need to think about that for our lives as well. When it comes to serving him on a day-to-day basis, we want to do what's right. But we also need to know that we are going to be held accountable for how we live and serve our God. Read with me in Mark chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and of rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. When they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, there's a lot more in this chapter. This is interesting. But you think from the get-go here in verse 1 and 2, what are they seeing? Well, they come out of the temple, and the disciples are talking about what a wonderful construction is all around them. And what does Jesus have to say about that? He doesn't say, "Oh, yes, these are wonderful." He says, "No, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." What is Jesus saying? Destruction. The time is coming to an end. These are ominous words from the Son of God who knows what's going to happen. And so naturally, there are some questions about this. Peter, James, John, and Andrew in verse 3 ask him privately, not what this is, but when will these things be? And notice what else in verse 4. What will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Now, the next part of our reading is really going to cover a lot about the what is the sign. But before that, Jesus does start to give some answers about when will these things be and what things that are going on. Now notice in verse 5 and then verse 13 how Jesus begins and ends his answer here. He is fixated on what? Their faithfulness, their endurance. Notice in verse 5, see that no one leads you astray. And in verse 13, you'll be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. So no matter what this conflict is, no matter what the trial may be, Jesus is telling the disciples desperately, please remain faithful. Don't fall for what? Well, in verse 6, false Christ. Many will say, "I am he," and they will lead many astray. Do not worry about wars and rumors of wars, verse 7. This must take place, but the end is not yet. Do not worry about these things. In fact, in verse 9, this is perhaps most scary. You don't even worry about being beaten, being thrown in prison, having to answer before kings and governors on my name's sake. You hear all that, you say, that seems like something that I'd worry about. If we're honest, these are things that bother us. In fact, if we're just being really honest and self-reflective this morning, we're going to realize, I worry about things a lot less serious than being beaten for my faith. And yet Jesus says again, what? Those who endure to the end will be saved. Now, the disciples had a special role in the kingdom, no doubt. And of course, as they thinks about why they should not worry, this is good for us to know. And this has a special context to the disciples here. But also we can take some lessons and be thankful and trusting in God from verse 11. When they bring you to try and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand about what you are to say. Now, think about that. You say, I think I'm going to be inclined to be anxious about that. But why not? Why does Jesus say to the disciples they don't have to be anxious? In fact, they should not be anxious. Well, verse 11, say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Jesus is letting them know you are going to suffer for my name's sake. That what is coming is a judgment upon Jerusalem. And yes, there is going to be ultimately a judgment in which we all stand before our Maker and give account for what we have done and how we have lived this life. But if you notice what he says, do not be anxious. Why? Because God will take care of you. In broad strokes, that's what he's telling them. In specifics, he says, God's going to guide you as to what you are going to say. And of course, why were they going to be on trial, of course? Well, they are going to be teaching, verse 10, the gospel to all nations. They're going to be even standing up for what's right. And so when we think about verse 13, you'll be hated by all for my name's sake. Jesus hears their question, but he is preoccupied with what really matters to them. And what is that? Putting him first, being ready for temptations and trials, being patient and trusting in God, standing up and being ready to give an account of Jesus before all who would ask. So we come to verse 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down or enter his house to take anything out. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. Now, again, we remember it. Peter, James, and John, and Andrew were asking, when will these things be, and what are the signs that these things are about to be accomplished? And Jesus starts to answer some of those questions. In verse 15, notice he says this, let the one who's on the housetop not go down. Don't go back and grab anything. And then verse 16, let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. Verse 17, alas for women who are pregnant, those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that may not happen in winter. That doesn't sound like a spiritual once for all end of the world judgment, does it? Because when God's going to come and this world is over, is it really going to matter if someone is pregnant? Am I really going to be tempted to go and grab my coat because the day of judgment is here? Well, no. Jesus has something in mind here, and he's thinking about the destruction of Jerusalem. As we studied in Matthew chapter 24 earlier this year, we recognize that Jesus was going to bring a judgment at the behest of God onto Jerusalem. And as we think about that, the disciples are given a little bit of a heads up here on what they are to expect. But notice in verse 19, for in those days there will be such tribulation as not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. This is no mere judgment. This is a destruction. What does that make us think of? We'll go back to verse 2. When the disciples had looked around and said how great the buildings are, how great the temple is, and he said, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. What do we do with this information? Why is God judging them? Well, certainly it's very clear they've rejected Jesus. And this needed to happen for a lot of very interesting reasons. And for the Jews, certainly to understand that there is a new dispensation, that we are no longer under the law of Moses, but we are moving forward in Christ, that our lineage no longer has that physical importance that it once did. We come down and we see also God is looking out for his children. Notice in verse 22, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I've told you all things beforehand. Jesus is warning them, hey, there's going to be these trials. There's going to be these false Christs. But you need to believe in me. You need to remember that I have shown you enough. God has always given us all that we need. And so, no, Jesus did not answer and say, hey, by the way, it's going to be March 14th. And it's going to be in this year. It's going to be at 7 o'clock. But he gave them what to look for. In fact, even he tells them things to look out for that really matter, those of spiritual consequence. Focus on me, Jesus would say. Your life is to be spent proclaiming the gospel and teaching my good news. Verse 24, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will be falling from heaven and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So this is very fascinating and fortunate for us because here is a little bit of a timing mechanism. Again, we know the world isn't over. That's not what Jesus is speaking about here. Number one, because of those context clues, right? It wouldn't matter if the world is over, if you're pregnant. It wouldn't matter if it's in winter. It wouldn't matter. You wouldn't go back and grab your cloak. But also notice here in verse 30, this generation will not will not pass until all these things take place. We see that's very clear that this destruction, this judgment is going to come in the lifetime of people who were contemporaries of Jesus in the flesh. Very important for us to understand that and to apply that specifically to what he is saying. And so what is he saying? Well, in verse 24, notice the tribulation that is going to be horrible. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. And most strikingly is verse 26. Son of Man is coming in clouds with great power and glory. What's happening there? Jesus is coming. Now, is that coming in the sense that he's coming back to this world once and for all? No, that's obviously not true because we haven't missed it. It's not over. But as you continue reading in verse 27, he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. What do we take refuge in? In God. In the fact that he sees who his people are. And yes, there's going to be this horrible destruction. But for those who are listening to Jesus, those who give their lives over to him, they will be ready. And so we need to be too. And while we're not living around AD 70 when Jerusalem is destroyed, and we're certainly not living there, we do need to be ready for judgment. We need to make sure that we aren't anxious about what's going on in this life because we know God is there for us, that he is our shelter, our fortress, our refuge. And so we know that he is in control and that he has the final say. And so we're going to trust his word. We're not going to be led astray. We're going to stay focused and we're going to serve him faithfully. In verse 32, but concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. What does Jesus say in verse 32 through the end of the chapter here? Be ready. Be watching. Be mindful that these things are going to take place. And by the way, there are many who consider those chapters like Matthew 24 and possibly even parts here of Mark chapter 13 as a final judgment. And if that's true, that's okay. Either way, the words of Jesus are the same. For the Jews in AD 70 or for us today, we need to be ready that there is going to be a day of the Lord, that judgment is real. And so we need to be prepared for that. It's terrifying to know that this horrible judgment in which many will be destroyed is coming. But it's wonderful news. It should be peace-bringing, and it should encourage us to greater faithfulness to know that God knows who his children are, that he has given us signs to look for, and most importantly, has shown us how to please him. And so, verse 33, we are going to be on guard. We are going to keep awake because we don't know when it's going to happen. So we're going to be ready. We're going to be watching, and we're going to spend every day like it's our last because it could be, because God has a plan, and we simply are here as stewards of what is his. I hope you join us tomorrow as we study Mark chapter 14 and move toward Jesus' betrayal and eventual crucifixion.